Good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to Chapter 3, Consumer Choice. So, I'll get up my little pen here. Oh, I can't use my pen. Okay, off we go to Chapter 7 here. Oops, there we go. Okay, so Chapter 7 deals with utility theory, and we look at the impact of our calculations of total and marginal utility on the selection of products that we consume and the quantities of each of those products that we consume. And then we look at the effect of diminishing marginal utility on determining the so-called consumer optimum. And the consumer optimum is simply the optimal quantity of goods that we consume. And the optimal quantity of goods we consume is equal to the point where the marginal utility per unit price of one product equals the marginal utility per unit price of another product are the same. So we have that formula. Okay, then we look at as part of this, we look at the price dependency of marginal utility analysis, because as the prices of products change, that affects the marginal utility per unit price, and that impacts the quantity of goods that we consume. And so changing prices changes the amount that we consume. And then we look at how the declining marginal utility explains the demand curve, which we know there's an inverse relationship between price and quantity. And then finally, in this middle section here, we look at the resolution of the so-called diamond water paradox that Adam Smith wrote about in The Wealth of Nations in 1776. And he resolves this so-called diamond water paradox through marginal utility analysis. And then the very final section of the chapter, there's a very brief comment about behavioral economics and how behavioral economics looks at the decision-making process a little bit differently than traditional economics. Okay, so let's just move on. So I've got a new little pen here, so I've got to do things slightly differently. It might not work actually, but I'm going to try. Okay, so utility theory. So utility theory is a microeconomics explanation of how consumers make choices. So we have this thing called utility, and it's defined as the capacity of a product to satisfy a want, satisfy a desire. And so our demand for products is a consequence of the utility that products have. But as we see, there's no objective measurement of utility, because utility is unique to each person, because each person has distinct tastes and preferences. But I kind of think that utility is a little bit like our concept of beauty, which we say is, quote unquote, in the eye of the beholder. So utility is a subjective concept, even though it applies to everybody. So although there's no objective measure of utility, we don't have a little utility meter or little utility measuring sticks or devices. We can infer how much utility people derive from consuming a product by looking at the relative quantities of different products that they consume. And so utility analysis is the analysis of consumer decision making based on utility maximization. We assume that consumers want to maximize the amount of utility. They want to maximize the amount of satisfaction they derive from consumption. And then kind of an interesting little piece here is this concept of a util. A util is defined as a single unit of satisfaction derived from product consumption. But because we don't have any objective way of measuring utility, we have no way of knowing, no way of identifying how big a util is. But anyways, even though we don't really have any measure of utils, it's kind of a useful concept to have, because we can say that it's just the smallest unit of satisfaction. It's kind of like an atom in the physical world, but it's applied to the satisfaction of desire world. Okay, so we draw this distinction between I have to get rid of this. Okay. Oops, did I miss something there? Sorry. No. So we draw this distinction between total utility and marginal utility. So total utility is the total satisfaction that we obtain from consuming a certain quantity of a product within a given time period. And we know from earlier on that marginal simply means incremental. So marginal utility is the incremental satisfaction we obtain from consuming one additional unit of a product within the same time period. So we can calculate marginal utility as the change in total utility divided by the change in number of units consumed. And of course, if we have only if we change the number of units by 1, then we have sort of another way of expressing marginal utility. Okay, so we go through a bit of a sample calculation here of marginal utility. Oops. Okay, so this is from the book. I can't remember which page it's on. So here we have our product, videos, our time period per week, and different quantities of videos per week. So 0 up to 6. We calculate our total utility for consuming these videos across this range. So watch no videos, no satisfaction. Watch one video, we get 10 units of satisfaction. We consume 2 videos per week, we get a total of 16 units of satisfaction. 3 videos, total of 19, and so on. And so the marginal utility is simply the change in total utility for the consumption of additional units. So we consume 1 additional unit. We start with 0 utility, we move up to 10, so our marginal utility associated with our first unit of consumption is 10. For our second unit of consumption, total utility is 16, so the difference between 16 and 10 is 6, and so on. So as our quantity of videos consumed increases, our total utility increases to a certain point, and then there's a point where we can overconsume a good, in which case our total utility starts to decline, and that means that our marginal utility at some point goes negative. Okay, so then we have a little plot of marginal utility on a graph against quantity consumed. So here's our, let's put by default. Okay, so here's our quantity of videos consumed per week, so per time period, so 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. And also our total utility increases as our quantity of videos consumed per week increases. And then there's a certain point where we kind of get sick of watching videos. And so if we watch too many videos within a short period of time, our total satisfaction actually declines. So we see total utility plateauing in lots of areas of life. You know, if we overeat or we overdrink, or if you're a smoker and you oversmoke, I guess you would say. If you overconsume many products, we tend to get physically sick. Or, you know, even if we're doing something enjoyable, like maybe you like playing hockey or like playing soccer or playing baseball, if we play too many baseball games in one weekend or in one day, or you take too many runs down the ski hill per day, we get physically tired. And that physical exhaustion is a sign of declining total utility. And when it comes to videos, I mean, if you watch too many videos in a short period of time, you are probably like me, you start getting them mixed up, and you kind of can't remember. You can't keep these different movies separate. I don't like watching too many movies at one time. Okay, and then we oops. Okay, so we plot marginal utility on the same x-axis. So here's our quantity of videos per week. Here's our marginal utility. As we increase our consumption of videos per week, our marginal utility declines. So what this really assumes is that our utility per unit consumed is maximized at a single unit, and every additional unit we consume results in declining additional satisfaction. Okay, and then we can kind of plot these two graphs beside each other just to kind of see how they're related, or see how they kind of correspond to each other. Clear. Okay, so here's our total utility, and marginal. Same quantity on the x-axis, same quantity videos per week. As we consume more and more videos, total satisfaction increases, but it increases at a decreasing rate. And at the point where our total satisfaction peaks, then marginal utility goes to 0. And if we consume past that point, then marginal utility turns negative. Okay, so off we go to the next section, looking at how diminishing marginal utility affects our overall satisfaction, or the selection of goods and the quantity of those goods or products that maximize our satisfaction. Okay, so diminishing marginal utility, it's really the principle that we can have too much of a good thing. So as we increase our quantity of a product consumed within a particular time period, although our total satisfaction increases, our total utility increases, but it increases at a decreasing rate. And once we max out on total satisfaction, then it starts to decline. And marginal utility turns negative. Okay. Oops, didn't click that. Okay, so we have this concept of the consumer optimum. So the consumer optimum is the set of products that we consume and the quantities of each that we consume that maximizes our total satisfaction. And this satisfaction is subject to our limited income. And this consumer optimum is reached through this marginal utility analysis, and it's also price dependent, which we'll see very shortly here. Okay. I think the book talks about two versions of the consumer optimum. The first version is kind of a theoretical state where we have no income constraint. So just imagine that you have $1 trillion, or you have all the money in the world. What quantity of each good would you consume? And the theory says that we would consume each product in the quantities to the point where marginal utility is 0 for all products. But in the real world, we don't have unlimited income. We do. Everybody is subject to an income constraint. So when we're subject to an income constraint, then the consumer optimum, the optimal quantity of each product that we consume, is the point where the marginal utility per unit price is the same for all products that we consume. Okay, so let's just motor on. Okay, so we have a calculation, or we have an illustration of arriving at the consumer optimum. So in this, here's our videos. Here's the same quantity of videos watched per week, 0 up to 5. We have a calculation of our total utility. We have a calculation of our marginal utility. So this is exactly what we had before. And now we calculate the marginal utility per per unit price. So in the example here, videos cost $5 to rent. So to calculate this marginal utility per dollar spent, we simply divide the marginal utility. So marginal utility of, so for the first unit consumed, we divide 50 divided by the $5 price, and that gives us 10. And for the second unit consumed, our marginal utility is 45. So we divide the 45 divided by the price of $5, and that gives us 9. And then for the third unit, it's $40, or our marginal utility is 40 units, 40 utils, divided by price of $5, and that gives us 8, 7.3, and 5.7. Okay, I was going to show you something actually before we kind of move on. I'll just kind of backtrack a bit here. So I know you probably figured this out by now, but when we want to calculate the a consumer optimum, we go through a three-step process, and I've kind of summarized it on another slide here, so just a sec. There we go, is that right? Oh, better clear that. Oh, okay. So here's a three-step process for calculating for determining the consumer optimum. Remember, the consumer optimum is the optimum quantity of every product that we want to consume. So the process is, step 1, we calculate the marginal utility per unit price for each product over some range of quantity. Then we compare the marginal utility per unit price for all these products. And then we allocate our income to the point where the marginal utility per unit price is the same for every product. And we exhaust all our income. So it's kind of a three-step process, and that's what the book goes through. We just go through this little example of it. So let's go back to the slides. Okay, and I just wiped out that slide, but anyways, I think you saw a demonstration of it. So we calculate the marginal utility per unit price for our first product, which is videos. Then we do the same calculation for our next product, which happens to be hamburgers. So our hamburgers, so here's our different quantities of hamburgers consumed per week, 0, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Here's our total utility associated with that consumption. We consume no hamburgers, no utility. Consume 1 hamburger, we get 25 utils of satisfaction. Consume 2 hamburgers, total of 47 units. Then we calculate the marginal utility for those consumed units. And then we divide by the price, and our hamburgers cost $3 a piece. So 25 divided by $3 equals 8.3. 22 divided by 3 equals 7.3. Oh, this is $3. It's a dollar sign. 18 divided by $3 is going to give us 6, and so on. Okay, so we calculate the marginal utility per unit price for every product in our set. And then we have to delete that, move on. Then we compare the marginal utility per unit price for our different products. So here's videos, price was $5 rental. Hamburgers, price was $3 a hamburger. And then we allocate our income on these quantities of the two products. So in this case, we only have two products. So in this case, we're going to consume 4 videos, and we're going to consume 4 videos, and we're going to consume 2 hamburgers. Why? Because the marginal utility per unit price for videos equals that of hamburgers at those quantities, and at these given prices. We'll see in a minute that these calculations are price dependent, and when we change the prices, then these calculations change, and that changes our consumer optimum, but we'll get to that in a bit. Okay, so this is just a consumer optimum all over again. So we have our videos on this side, we have our hamburgers on this side. Here's our different, here's the four videos that we consume, because when we consume our 4th video, that gives us a marginal utility per unit price of 7.3, and we reach that same 7.3 marginal utility per unit price of 7.3 at the consumption of only our 2nd hamburger. Okay, and then we allocate our income, our total income, to these 2 products in these quantities, and that's our consumer optimum when we only have 2 products in our sort of universe. If we had more products in our universe, we would do the same thing. We would calculate the marginal utility per unit price for each one of the products in our total set, and again we would choose the quantity of each one of these individual products to the point where the marginal utility per unit price was the same for all these different products. Okay, so that's one way that we can allocate our income. We can just find the quantities of the different products that have equal marginal utility per unit price the same. So we allocate our entire income that way. And then there's a second technique for allocating our income that the book mentions, and we'll look at it briefly here. So the second way, and I have to admit, I changed this slide slightly from the ones that you have. I think the slide that you have only goes to, it only has this material on the left-hand side. And so what I did is I added this column on the right-hand side. And so what we do is we create a list. So we calculate our marginal utility per dollar per unit price for our two products. Then we combine those 2 lists and we sort the lists from highest to lowest in terms of marginal utility per unit price. And then we simply go down the list allocating our income until we run out of income. So when we create our list, the first video has 10 utils of satisfaction, so that's the highest on the list, so we rent our first video. Then then our second video has the second highest marginal utility per unit price at 9, so we allocate the next quantity of our income towards the second video. And then we see that our first hamburger has a marginal utility per unit price of 8.3, so that's next in descending order, so we allocate income to that. Then our third video has a marginal utility per unit price of 8, and then we come down to the point where the 2 products have the same marginal utility per unit price. That's our 4th video and our second hamburger, and we should be at the end of our income at this point. Okay. So we mentioned earlier on that this marginal utility analysis is price dependent. So we're going to look at an example of what happens when our prices change. So starting point, here's our consumer optimum. Here's our consumer optimum. Consumer optimum. So it's the quantity of product A that has a marginal utility per unit price equal to the marginal utility per unit price of the second product, equaling the marginal utility per unit price of every other product in our set. So this is C, D, E, and so on. And so these quantities of these products are price dependent, because when we change the price, our marginal utility per unit price will change, and that'll affect the quantities that we need to consume to arrive at the consumer optimum. Okay, so in our first example here, so this is the example we've just gone through. So we have videos, and we set at the consumer optimum, we consume 4 videos per week, and then we have hamburgers, and at the consumer optimum, we consume 2 videos per week. And so why do we get there? Because the marginal utility per unit price is the same for both products at these quantities. And given the prices. Video rentals cost $5 a piece, and hamburgers cost $3 a piece. So now the question is, what happens when we change the prices of the products? So what we're going to do is we're going to change the price of videos from $5 to $4. So notice here, we consume 4 units of videos per week. Okay, I say I better click it twice. Okay, so now we assume that the price of videos declines from $5 per rental down to $4. So now that's going to change all of our marginal utility per unit prices. So previously we consumed 4 videos per week, because our marginal utility at that point was 36.5. In the first example, it was a price of 5, so we had 36.5 divided by 5, and that gave us 7.3. So as our price declines from $5 down to $4, the value of this calculation changes, so we shrink the price, and so our marginal utility per unit price increases. So to reach our consumer optimum, we want to have the quantity of each product such that the marginal utility per unit price is the same for every product. So since this marginal utility per unit price for videos is now higher than it was before, it used to be 7.3, we're going to consume more videos. We're going to consume more videos in order to bring down this marginal utility per unit price down to a level that then equals that of the other products that we consume. There we go. So as the price of videos decline from $5 to $4, the marginal utility of videos per price now exceeds that of hamburgers. Originally it was 7, now it's 9.13, and for hamburgers it's 7.3. So we're going to consume more videos, and as our consumption of videos increases, we know that our marginal utility is also going to decline. Oops. as our consumption, as our quantity of videos increases, our marginal utility will decline. So we can use marginal utility analysis to explain the downward slope of the demand curve. Way back in chapter 2 or chapter 3, we said that there was an inverse relationship between price and quantity. The inverse relationship between price and quantity was the law of demand, and so we said that the demand curve had a negative slope to it. And so we can kind of see this. If our starting point is, if videos are originally $5 a price, this gives us a certain marginal utility. And, okay, that gives us a certain marginal utility. These quantities on the bottom, they don't quite correspond to the quantities that we saw earlier, but it doesn't really matter. We're just trying to explain why the demand curve has a negative slope to it based on marginal utility analysis. So the figures on the bottom, they're not consistent with before, but they don't have to be. Okay, so originally we consume 5 videos per week. Sorry, when videos are $5 per unit, there's a corresponding amount of marginal utility for that price, and there's a certain quantity that we consume too. So when the price declines to 4, we would expect the quantity to consume, the quantity that we consume to increase. As price declines, quantity consumed increases, and that's going to correspond to a lower marginal utility. So we'll see this, maybe, okay. Okay, so as the price declines, the marginal utility per unit price increases. So we increase our consumption of that product. We increase our consumption of that product to the point where, so the marginal utility declines, and at this new consumption point, then our marginal utility per unit price will be the same as for our other products. So when prices change, the point is when prices change, the consumer optimum changes as well. And the consumer optimum is the optimum quantity of all the different products that we consume in our set. And so we can see that as price declines, our quantity consumed increases, and that corresponds to decreasing marginal utility. So we saw this. I'm just going to clear this. We saw this way back on the. We saw this. Earlier today. We saw this earlier today. As our quantity consumed increases, our marginal utility per unit decreases. And so this marginal utility curve is the demand curve. I think in the last chapter, in chapter 6, we called, instead of calling it the marginal utility analysis, we called this marginal benefit. But really marginal utility is just another name for benefit, because utility is a measure of satisfaction. So here's our declining marginal utility curve, and it corresponds to the demand curve. Okay, let's just move on. Okay, so this next little section, so that's the theoretical basis of the shape of the demand curve. It's based on this diminishing marginal utility curve. Okay, so next little section is the diamond water paradox that Adam Smith talked about in his Wealth of Nations in 1776. Oh, where is it here? Okay, so And then Smith has this resolution to the paradox that's based on marginal utility analysis. So Adam Smith made this observation that he thought it was incongruent that important goods have low prices and relatively unimportant goods have high prices. And his example was water versus diamonds. We know that water is essential to life. We have to have water in our bodies to survive. But in the real world, water tends to be fairly inexpensive. On the other hand, we have these, so even though water is important, it has a low price. But diamonds, which most of us would think of as sort of a cosmetic kind of product, they're really not, they're not essential to life, but they have a high price. And Smith said this is kind of a paradox. Something that's important has a low price, and something that's not important has a high price. How come? So what Smith effectively said was, yes, although water is important, we consume it in large quantities. And since we consume it in large quantities, we consume it, the marginal utility of the final unit consumed is quite low. And that low marginal utility corresponds to its low price. And diamonds, although they're not essential to life, they're expensive. And they're expensive because we consume them in small quantities. And so the marginal utility for a diamond wearer, I guess someone who's wearing diamond jewelry, the marginal utility is quite high, but the price is also quite high. But at the end of the day, the marginal utility per unit price of water equals the marginal utility per unit price of diamonds. And so this is the consumer optimum. We consume a small quantity of diamonds in a large quantity of water. And that brings us into the consumer optimum. And that's his resolution of the paradox. He says, yes, diamonds have a high price because we consume them in small quantities. They have high marginal utility and a high price. Water we consume it in large quantities. So water has a low marginal utility at the point where we consume it, and it has a low price. But at the consumer optimum, the marginal utility per unit price is the same for both. Anyways, and he says that's the resolution to this paradox. They have the same marginal utility per unit consumed. And the same kind of paradox can be drawn with different types of water. And I can't remember if this example's in the book or not, but we have a bottled water. So we can place diamonds here with bottled water. And we know that bottled water is quite expensive. Geez, if you ever go on an airplane, geez, you're paying like $4 for a little 500 milliliters worth of water. So bottled water is quite expensive. And we don't consume huge quantities of bottled water, but we consume huge quantities of tap water when we take a bath or we take a shower. So we consume expensive bottled water in small quantities, but we consume tap water in relatively large quantities. How is it that the same product has these different prices? And the answer is we attach greater marginal utility to bottled water because we can carry it around with us. We can put it in our pocket. We can and so on. But we can't carry around tap water. We just let tap water run down the drain. So at the consumer optimum, we consume small quantities of this high marginal utility product and large quantities of this low marginal utility product, which also has a low price. And at the consumer optimum, they have a marginal unit per unit price of the same. So that's the theory. Okay, so the final little section in this chapter, as we mentioned earlier, deals with the perspective from a different branch of economics on consumer choice. So it's the very last page in this chapter. The author gives us a bit of a insight into how this other branch of economics called behavioral economics looks at consumer choice. So, and there's a couple examples on those pages about how some types of decisions that people make under the behavioral view. So I have a very brief comparison between traditional economics and behavioral economics. So in traditional economics, it's a theory-based approach to explaining things, and it views man, and of course that means women as well, but it views man as a rational animal. When we make decisions, those decisions serve our best interest. So this is our marginal utility analysis of consumption. We consume products because they satisfy our desires, and we consume the particular products we do consume in certain quantities up to the point where the marginal utility per unit price of one product equals the marginal utility per unit price of all the other products. That gives us maximum satisfaction. And it sort of assumes that we have this calculating kind of mind that keeps track of all this utility and the prices corresponding to those products until we bring ourselves into the consumer optimum. And so our consumption patterns adjust due to the effect on utility from changing prices and consume quantities. I don't think you can land in a sentence with a preposition, but I guess it's not really a sentence. Okay, and then we have behavioral economics. So modern traditional economics began with Adam Smith in 1776. Effectively, he's the start of modern traditional economics. And behavioral economics has been around for just over a generation. I think it's been around for about 40 years or so. I think it started back in the 80s. I guess it's only about 30 years, 35, almost 40 years. Okay, so behavioral economics, it doesn't use theory. It devises these experiments, and it observes how people actually do stuff. And their view of mankind is a little bit different than the traditionalists, because they notice that sometimes we make decisions that are not necessarily in our best interest. I mean, the traditional view is, we're utility maximizers, and we keep adjusting our consumption patterns to maximize our satisfaction. But the behavioralists say that sometimes we make these irrational decisions, and we make decisions that aren't necessarily, from an objective point of view, they're not necessarily in our best interest. Anyway, so they kind of see that we make some of our consumption pattern decisions are based on emotional factors and these psychological, I'll call them psychological quirks. So, from the agenda video that I've come up with a small supplementary video that gives us some examples from one of the leaders of the behavioral economics field. And so if you're interested in seeing some additional examples and to get a bit of a sense in how behavioral economics works, these experiments, they're really quite fascinating. You can watch that video. Anyways, so that's it for Chapter 7. And I believe next week we're off to Chapter 8. And Chapter 8 will be the last chapter before the midterm. Anyways, so that's it for Chapter 7. And we'll talk to you later.